Good evening, everybody. I can't see you. It's very dark out there, but I'm guessing you can see me. I'm Isla Berman, the Director of Architecture at CCA, and it's with great pleasure that I'm able to welcome Paul Lewis this evening as our lecturer. Paul is a partner of Lewis Zernemaki Lewis, LTL, a highly innovative and award-winning architectural firm that's located in New York City. The work of LTL, which has been extensively published, and most recently in a monograph on their work authored by the three partners entitled Opportunistic Architecture, that's published by Princeton Architectural Press, their firm has received widespread attention as a practice that's invested in generating highly innovative and intelligent architectural solutions that negotiate and transform constraints into new creative spatial and material opportunities. For those of you who have heard your professors tell you that limits are often good, pay close attention this evening. To those who have made a career out of exploiting restrictions in order to engender new possibilities from the latent material embedded in every project. Their willingness to engage the rules of practice or the limits of the architectural real is what enables them to close the gap between design speculation and the profession, and to remove themselves from the oppositional stalemate that has existed between pragmatically complicit and critically resistant forms of practice. As they classify themselves as part alchemist, part realist, what is often most compelling is their ability to turn the ordinary into the truly extraordinary by overlaying rigorous forms of research and documentation with nonlinear forms of creative inquiry and provocation. LTL has received numerous awards for its design work, with the firm's attention to details and materials acknowledged in 2007 when it received the National Design Award for Interior Architecture from the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum. The firm's work was also included in the Cooper Hewitt's 2000 National Design Triennial and has been exhibited at the SF MoMA, the Walker Art Center, and the Carnegie Museum of Art. In 2004, LTL was selected as one of the 6 American architectural firms to be featured in the U.S. Pavilion at the Venice Architectural Biennale. Paul Lewis received his Master of Architecture from Princeton University School of Architecture, where he is currently an assistant professor and also the director of graduate studies. He is a fellow of the American Academy in Rome and the winner of the 1998-1999 Mercedes G. Bass Rome Prize in Architecture. And Paul is also on the board of directors of the Architectural League of New York. I'm very pleased that Paul has agreed to come lecture this evening. Please join me in welcoming Paul Lewis.
Thank you. Thank you, Isla. It's fantastic to be here. And I will probably talk for about 3 or 4 hours, so hopefully your feet won't get too tired for those of you standing. Actually, in all honesty, what I would like to do is present about 16 projects, 14 to 16 projects relatively with a certain degree of rapidity. For us, the difference between the projects is mirrored by a consistent kind of logic that we bring to each project. As Isla mentioned, we try to kind of look very closely at the constraints that any project has as a kind of given, and to turn those constraints into a kind of generative trajectory for the project. In other words, we kind of seek what we call architectural play from the very kind of burdens that you might actually kind of bemoan at the beginning of a project. And often this involves kind of asking what we call what-if questions, questions that are looking for opportunistic exchanges really between material, budget, form, program, client expectations, code, etc. Inherently, the kind of different types of projects come with different types of constraints, and our work tends to kind of congregate into four different types of work: speculative projects, which are intentionally not meant to be built, exhibitions, more traditional architectural buildings, and design-build interiors. And what I mean by the fact that they have kind of different natures to begin with, and they have kind of, as a result, different idiosyncrasies and different trajectories, is that, for example, speculative projects not meant to be built, therefore aren't constrained by questions of budget. They're often not constrained by questions of code, but they then have to have a kind of invention relative to representation, relative to the ways of kind of externalizing the project. So inherent in all 4 of these are a kind of desire on our part to kind of externalize work, to get stuff to the level of kind of seduction and fruition, given the kind of different qualities that are inherent within the different types. So I'll jump right in and start with some of the design, build, interior work that we did in New York City. These were done in a period of about 2 to 3 years. There were about 6 restaurants, and restaurants in New York have a lifespan of about 1 year. So in a sense, we saw them as, and I'm not joking, actually, the average restaurant in New York lasts 1 year. So our assumption was that we wanted to treat these as really kind of material experimentations, almost more as a kind of family of kind of art installations, if you will, in part because every project is often, every New York restaurant really seems to be kind of split into 2 different personalities. On the one hand, the plan has to be highly efficient, which means that you have to kind of maximize profit, seating, et cetera, which in a sense limits the architectural invention or seduction to a thickened surface about 6 or 8 inches that form the perimeter of the walls and ceilings of these spaces. Often these spaces are very small also. And so for Fluff Bakery, we decided to work with about 3 miles of 3/4 inch felt and 3/4 inch stained Baltic birch plywood, and that this would then be aggregated or stacked similar to the way in which one would kind of stack bricks, frankly. And it had an interesting quality in that in elevation, or I should say in perspective, it induced what we almost thought of as a horizontal vertigo, kind of really a real velocity to the sense of the space. Whereas when you move to the elevation, there's a kind of a stillness. It affected a kind of calm. And if you notice here, this is actually a speaker. That's the transition from the wall to the ceiling. So not only did it kind of slow the optical effects, but it also kind of flattened space into a kind of single surface. We were working with a combination of felt and wood to achieve also different kind of performative qualities. We wanted the kind of recipe at the lower level to be darker to avoid stains from the coffee, and as you work your way up the ceiling, it would become lighter. In addition to operating acoustically, it worked very well. It's kind of seat backing. So we like to find ways that we kind of induce what we term kind of multivalent performance, that it operates on many levels, optically, acoustically, materially. From a budget standpoint, this was actually quite cost effective. Contractor originally listed the work on here at about $80,000. We were able to do it in our office for about $20,000 and made a small profit on top of it. So sometimes you have to get your hands dirty to realize your dream. The ceiling, we developed a kind of different approach, whereas the walls had this kind of excessive linearity. We wanted to find a way that the ceiling light would actually kind of branch in a kind of quasi-organic way across the space, distributing light evenly, but without the appearance of kind of a kind of repetitive system. It had almost kind of a pattern that although it obviously was based on a series of bends, the accumulation actually became actually somewhat chaotic. And then for the street, we wanted to find a way that the architecture itself became the signage, the seduction. And here we reference this as similar to the moment in Star Wars where they jumped into hyperspace, that kind of extreme velocity. And this restaurant lasted 8 months before it got turned into an Irish bar. Zing Restaurant was an interesting condition in which you had the Manhattan dumbbell problem in plan, namely that there are the light wells of the tenement building above pinching and separating the front space from the back space. So our thought was, rather than try to kind of force a singular reading of the entire interior, what happens if we actually accentuate this difference? In a sense, using the kind of surrealist game of the exquisite corpse, where one person draws the leg, connects with a tiny tissue of two or four lines. Next person does the feet to the leg, and then to the torso and the head. We wanted to kind of, in a sense, intensify the separation between these different spaces, and actually made the space move from stone material up front, where it's more public, to bamboo, to acrylic, to velvet, where it's most private in the back. And here you can see from the street the accumulation of those different layers, and in a sense the kind of accumulation of the different materials, and more importantly also then the kind of connections, the equivalent of the lines that connect the different folds of the exquisite corpse were now played out with the continuity here of the 2-inch by 1/4-inch acrylic stacks, stack material that formed both the kind of light shelf and then also the bar itself, which also had the optical consequence of inducing a kind of forced perspective, and given the fact that it went from 8 feet wide down to 2 feet wide. So it got the illusion of a greater depth within this relatively small space. And then finally, to the back of the space, looking at, thinking about the space almost as an inhabitable banquette, that the architecture really became a piece of furniture completely lined in velvet. This is now a lasagna restaurante. It used to be fusion, it's still there, but they've added some awnings. And they actually asked us at one point if we wanted to come in and turn it into an Italian restaurant. And I think we declined for fear that we couldn't, we just didn't have the heart to do it. Anyway, so Tide's Restaurant. This was a project where the space was actually higher than it was wide. And we wanted to try to find a way that working with objects that were going to be used in the kitchen, we could actually use the ceiling as a site of distraction to mitigate the fears of claustrophobia. So we work with about 110,000 bamboo skewers. We exhausted the East Coast supply of bamboo skewers 3 times over, and these were then inserted into basically fairly conventional drop ceiling panels, and then aggregated and placed into that drop ceiling, forming a kind of underwater topography of the skewers, referencing the name of the restaurant, Tides, and in so doing, providing that site of distraction, trying to mitigate some of the very compressed nature of the space itself. And finally, the smallest of the restaurants, this really was a hot dog stand, frankly. It was about 200 square feet, and the thought was to say, okay, we give the kitchen as much space as it needs, set up the line of exchange, and then really develop the entire space as almost a kind of formalization of the act of coming in, looking, buying, walking out, eating, and then leaving the hot dog stand. So it's almost like takes the act of going and getting a hot dog and turning it into an architectural project. The space, as I mentioned, was very small, and so we counterintuitively suggested to the client that they actually make it smaller, that they raise the floor 6 inches and then drop the ceiling about 2 feet 6, moving from a space that's about 11 feet up front to barely 7 feet in the back. And in a sense, what we were trying to do is much like the acrylic area of Zing, we wanted to induce a kind of false or forced perspective. So to go from here, which is the more normative condition, to here, which is the kind of artificially compressed space. And here's the shot of the dash dogs in place in the Lower East Side. The argument for the client was that when people went up and got their hot dog, that the forced perspective would actually make their hot dogs look bigger. Which when you're trying to sell something like this, you need a hook like that, however much of an artifice it might be. In any case, we wanted to play out this argument not just in terms of the overall space, but in terms of the materialization. So if you look closely, the entire floor, wall, and ceiling was actually made out of 1/8-inch blackened steel planks. And they actually moved from being 6-inch wide by the street to 2 inches wide up front. And they were every other plank was gapped, producing essentially a dotted line that forms the transition from entry, purchase, and then exit. Also, we were looking at ways that we could take the kind of counter and actually cantilever it from outside the space moving in. And the counter, in effect, was the only thing flat or level within this space. And the difference between its flatness and the sloping floor meant that anybody of any height would have a comfortable location to stand within the space to eat their hot dog. It was made out of kind of stacking acrylic, not acrylic, bamboo, and that bamboo, I don't think you can quite see it, but the steel structure in the middle is actually equivalently gapped to match the gaps in the floor. These are kind of details I don't think anybody noticed, but we got very obsessed with them. As a final detail, one of the things, because we ended up making all of the kind of final surface on here, when you're drilling steel, the most painful and time-consuming thing is actually kind of notching the location of the drill point. So we thought we would just simply, whoever was on the drill press could drill as they liked. So wherever they wanted to put a hole, they could, as long as it was roughly within no greater than 1'6" spacing. So the random pattern of the screws was actually simply a product of how somebody on the drill press wanted to kind of slide the steel down the line. Okay, shifting gears to an installation project. This is the plan we were given for the Venice Biennale from 2004, the United States Pavilion. And Architecture Record curated the U.S. Pavilion that year, and they asked 6 relatively young architects from the United States to exhibit their work. Each of us was charged with rethinking a particular American building type. We were asked to rethink the parking structure. And this is the plan we were given, and we were actually told we would have this front space. And when we first got the plan, we were quite excited. We figured, oh, look, we're right in the front of the building. It seems to be the largest room. Isn't this great? And then we actually got a photograph of the American Pavilion and realized that we were being asked to exhibit drawings and models, architectural representations in a space that was fairly inhospitable to the delicacy of that work. Not only that, we had to confront the fact there were almost no wall spaces that one could really exhibit on. So we had to kind of turn this difficulty into our advantage. And our thought was to say, all right, well, could we take the columns, and namely the kind of emphasis or slope of the column, and actually revolve it out into the space, turning 4 frontal columns into, in effect, 3 corridors. So in a sense, moving from the kind of singular or the collection of frontal columns into these kind of fingers that then gave us our surfaces on which to display our drawings and our analysis. It ended up being panels that were about 20 feet long. They were 13 feet high. And it meant, and I don't quite see it here, but all of the images above eye level here had to be anamorphically distorted to correct for the fact that you'd be standing quite close to the panels to be able to see. The panels themselves, what we wanted to do by extruding these corridors is then to play a difference between the left and the right-hand side. So the left-hand side of each of the columns now was used as an analysis of the problems and pleasures of parking in plans, and the right-hand side of those columns would be used for our speculative projects about essentially parking as played out in section. The problem is that we had developed two projects prior to being asked by Architecture Record. We developed Park Tower as a new project, but based on the kind of serial nature of these columns, we had a 4th panel we didn't know what the hell to do with. And so we started looking at some of the fundraiser, or I should say sponsored companies that might be able to donate some money. And in so doing, we came across the Car Freshener Corporation that actually makes these things worldwide. And they come in kind of amazing flavors. Obviously, new car, but you also get the smell of Portuguese sport. You get black ice, and all different languages. Really, kind of amazing things. And the Car Freshener Corporation donated 2,700 air fresheners, which we then kind of accumulated onto this last panel, similar to the way in which one might do a mosaic, effectively producing a cross-section of a 1971 VW Bug at full scale. I don't know if you can quite see it here, but there's 2 wheels, the seats, and so forth. And so we really like the idea that in Venice, a city with essentially no cars, we would actually be imaging an automobile at the resolution of an air freshener pixel. A final note on this is that, I don't know if you can quite see it here, but that's the first air freshener that was stolen. By the end of the exhibition, all of them were gone, except the ones way up here that nobody could reach. So. Park Tower was the project we developed specifically in response to Architecture Record's challenge to rethink the nature of the parking garage. And so for us, the thought was, could we actually take a kind of cliche, an architectural cliche, namely the kind of continuous surface? Like, basically, I think every architecture student in the last 10 years has done some project with a continuous surface, working its way up. And so we said, all right, let's take that cliche and combine it with a new technology, namely hydrogen or electric vehicles. And in so doing, could we actually then find a way to take the suburban desires of parking with extreme proximity to program and actually position that desire within an urban footprint, namely a kind of very small precinct and therefore producing a drive-up skyscraper. A drive-up skyscraper that, depending on how you count it, is either 35 stories or 70 stories, involving a double helix of parking and program. That as an accumulated building would actually be organized according to a lower level of retail, middle level of hotel, a level above that of office, and then finally of housing. And each of these would be, the programs would be located relative to their need for parking. So retail, which requires more parking per square foot, would be at the lower level, whereas housing, which requires less parking per square foot, would be at the upper level. So in a sense, we got this kind of cross-section through a tower, a mixed-use tower, that effectively allows one to drive and commute all the way up the building, both through parking levels and also a series of express ramps that kind of bypass every fifth floor. Just to go through this a little bit more slowly, the retail level really allowed us to take the strip mall and actually wrap it around itself, torque it around itself, thereby providing a parking space, or every parking space, I should say, is a good parking space, has great proximity to the program, and that connection and that kind of torquing of the strip mall around itself produces a more social atrium with a series of crisscrossing escalators and ramps. The motel level, in a similar way, wanted to take a kind of suburban model, the motel, and actually combine it with the Portland kind of high-end atrium motel. So in a sense, wrapping the motel around the perimeter of the more spectacular or spectacle-based Portland style atrium. So here you see the parking underneath every motel room, and then this starts to frame around the lobby of the hotel, including a kind of an express ramp that flies through the lobby, and then even some details where we could actually take the parking circulation drive as the actual diving board for the swimming pool of the hotel itself. And finally, on the upper level, looking at the residential area, here the building is a little bit less dense, and we were very interested in finding ways that we could use a kind of horizontal extrusion of the apartments to produce a vertical neighborhood. So kind of thwarting the horizontal problem of sprawl and inducing a new notion of a kind of vertical neighborhood where you still get the kind of the lawn chairs, and all of the kind of amenities of suburbia, but in a totally different configuration. This is shifting from a speculative project to a more, I guess, conventional architectural project. We had worked with the College of Worcester in Ohio to look at de-densifying 3 existing dormitories, and that over a period of about 2 or 3 years led to developing the program for a new residence hall that would be located here. The College of Worcester is a college of about 2,000 students, small town in Ohio, and interestingly enough, it turns out that the actual hallways of the dormitories are really the streets, if you will, for the students. It's their urban life. It's the center of their focus. So not only did we want to find a way in which the building would actually work well relative to its kind of corner site, allowing access into a garden beyond, but we also wanted to find a way that the hallway itself would be treated as a street. We moved away from suite-style living or apartment-style living, which was the kind of trend in college dormitories, back to the double-loaded corridor. It's less expensive, and most importantly, it induces more social exchanges. And in the era of iPods and various other personal devices, architecture has the capacity to induce greater socialization, and that's precisely what we wanted to do with this residence hall. So all of the social spaces, the lounges, the study nooks, the circulation, the elevator, the kitchenettes were all congregated around this exterior space. And the exterior space was actually kind of an interesting byproduct of a kind of requirement that came with the project, namely that the donor, Mr. Bornheater, wanted to put his name on the biggest building that he could fund, but the program actually required two separate buildings based on we wanted to limit the halls to about 30 students, and the height limit on campus was 3.5 to 4 stories. So in a sense, we had to do two buildings, but the donor was paying for one. So the outcome of that was this, in a sense, the heart of the building, this exterior space, this kind of captured courtyard space. And that courtyard space really animated the entire building. It's a fairly, I mean, this building was $145 a square foot. It was built in 12 months and had to last for 50 to 100 years. So it's very tight budget, very fast construction phase. So we had to find ways to be quite literally opportunistic with the budget to work to the advantage of the architecture. So this exterior space became the heart. It both animated the space during the day, and as it shifted from day to night, you'd get these kind of great transitions of light as the sunlight would cast through the channel glass up front, and then at night you get the kind of shift of the intensity of the study nooks coming through that glass. The channel glass was actually installed at 45 degrees, so the building would appear to be more transparent from the street, but provide some degree of privacy from the cars as they drove around the corner. As I mentioned, the heart really was this theater space, this exterior courtyard, where each of the hallways had their own cantilevered kind of study nook. And these would then be played off against the pre-patinated copper and the 45-degree channel glass. All of the lounges were aggregated to the back of the space and covered in a curtain wall, allowing anyone in any one of the lounges to find out what's kind of going on within the rest of the building. And from the inside, this curtain wall allowed for as much continuity as possible to the park that existed beyond. This is, for me, one of the nicest moments of the building, where the buildings actually kiss each other right at that line. So from either direction, you can actually see to the outside. And then from within the study nook, one has the ability to be in a kind of moment of intimacy or kind of ability to study in private, but also to be able to kind of lean out and kind of glimpse the comings and goings of the building, and also look across to what's happening in the other theater boxes. So it kind of exchanges of being on display, just being engaged within this kind of more complex series of visual conditions. And finally, a detail that for us kind of epitomized the project, taking the most monumental aspect of the building, the kind of eyebrow, and turning it into a kind of prosaic scene. So shifting from the monumental to the kind of human moment within the architecture. Want to talk about what were both called visioning projects, which is another way to say that this is where architects are brought in to make real estate look better than it might actually be. That's a cynical way of describing it. But these were both projects for different neighborhoods within New York City who felt that they were much maligned. They were going to be the locations of either bus depots or garbage dumps. So they kind of reached out to architects to find ways to kind of come up with a kind of a vision, a kind of an approach to how they might be seen. The first one was Hudson Square, which is on the west side of Manhattan. This is actually Canal Street coming across here. This is the Hudson Square area. And it's actually kind of an interesting space in that it has two gigantic buildings, very large, kind of almost kind of mega structures. Large super blocks is the better word. The UPS building and the St. John's building. They cover about four to about 6 blocks respectively. And our thought was, could we actually maintain the idiosyncrasies of these buildings, but still return the grid? Could we actually get the grid and the super block to coexist? And quite literally by taking the grid in section and moving it up through the super block, imagining that the main road, Washington Street, would actually be elevated to use the roofs of the building as the main street level, working with a kind of a new park-like surface. And most importantly then, thinking about ways that we can actually take the sidewalk and extend the sidewalk as the grid through a series of vertical ramps, working its way up over this lawn, engendering a kind of new type of apartments that are projected or cantilevered off of the sidewalk. So here's the view looking at the way in which the streets are being brought up on top of the roof of the UPS building, existing UPS building, and then the way in which the sidewalks would be extended through a series of ramps leading to apartments that would cantilever to the south, creating these kind of new courtyards or neighborhoods, and then developing the apartment as a kind of diagram of how they might exist. Now, the interesting thing for us is that these kind of projects have to actually come to a level of believability, and that believability is, I mean, in a sense, this is not going to be built. It has to actually be drawn in such a way that it gives a kind of vitality and legibility to its potential. And so for us, the kind of nature of the kind of cross-sectional perspective, being able to kind of both show a sense of inhabitation, but also a kind of dimensional, a moment of being able to see the kind of organization, playing off the ability to, in a sense, inhabit a drawing, but also show how it works through a kind of more abstract cut. If you look closely, you'll realize there's some structural problems with this, namely, but there's a level at which within a 1 month exercise, the intention is not to be built; it's to make a space and a kind of an intent and a typology, a new model legible. The second is a more recent one. We with a number of other people, worked on for Greenwich South, which is the area south of the World Trade Center, which is here. It's east of West Street, north of Battery Park, and west of Broadway. And we were asked to come in and look at the neighborhood from a sustainability standpoint. And this involves kind of at least two paradoxes. On the one hand, a lot of aspects of sustainability are actually not best made legible through architectural means. In other words, mechanical systems, insulation, energy use, water retention, these are not always best illustrated through architectural techniques. On the other hand, as I mentioned before, there is an imperative that the architectural representations actually give a kind of a future, kind of a sense of what might happen. So we end up kind of doing drawings like this that start to look at ways in which one could kind of push green roofs to an extreme, pull back from the number of cars that might be there, cover over the tunnels and so forth. But at some level, this type of project has a kind of limit, right? At a certain point, if you use a green marker, does it actually make it a green project? This was for us a kind of a tricky state to be in. It was a difficult project along those lines. What we also wanted to work on, though, is the other paradox, which is that simultaneously you have to be sufficiently pragmatic that one can imagine that it could occur. At the same time, you don't want to fall into simply kind of a kind of boring repetition of what everyone already knows. So you have to simultaneously pragmatic and kind of utopian at the same time. So these projects, we did three more specific projects. So we're looking at ways that we could take say a parking garage and turn it into a kind of a wetlands by increasing its structure. Ways that a floor of the parking garage could be used to kind of turn the excrement produced in the neighborhood into kind of biogas and compost. And then even looking at ways that we could take an existing bike path and intensify its use through section, making a kind of bike epicenter where one could park, repair your bike, et cetera, and encouraging greater bicycle use within the neighborhood. And then even a potential for what we call the green sponge, where in a sense a kind of new type of building, let me step back, a new urban type that was neither building nor landscape, really seen as a kind of a scaffolding that would then be inhabited by plants, various lightweight pathways for pedestrians, in a sense a kind of a cleansing device for the exhaust fumes coming out of the tunnel. But these are again tricky projects because they're specifically about ways in which architecture can both can imagine what might occur. They have to operate pragmatically, yet at the same time their service is often relative to promoting real estate and kind of discouraging potential uses of the neighborhood that the local business district is trying to avoid. So I'm still kind of wrapping my head around exactly what the architect's role within these projects are. But in the as a kind of speculative operation, it's actually certainly enjoyable to be paid to come up with these ideas. All right, I'll move to some more recent projects. This was an office space for NYU, about 16,000 square feet in New York, where we were asked to actually combine about 6 different offices into a single office of social and cultural studies. And by the time we actually counted up every faculty member and positioned all of the faculty members who had requested offices that had windows, we essentially had kind of occluded and blocked off the entire space. And so in some ways our role was to actually try to edit back, to try to move, to try to find a way we could carve out public spaces, carve out student gathering areas within this number, trying to find different ways to kind of double people up, to be able to gain social spaces within this. Our worry was the kind of rabbit warren, of too many offices and not enough kind of sense of volume. So the other technique was to try to find a way that all of the architectural forms would appear to be added into the space, so that they would stay shy of the ceiling. They would appear to, in a sense, float. And even looking at ways that we could take walls and actually extend them into grounds, treating large volumes as being figural within this fairly large pancake floor space. Here looking at working with different stripes of cork and a wall that inclines in an opposite direction down here and actually pivots the opposite way until it hits the back of seats, and even a detail where we could take the faculty's books and make them a kind of a display case that people could pull out and witness what had currently been written. The lounges were working with perforated ceilings to try to animate the space, and even looking at what we kind of called floor snakes that would kind of grow benches out of the floor. And here looking at the collection of offices, and again the detail where a faculty member could have placed their book in their nameplate, so their book became essentially kind of an identification, arguably a way of the argument was that we could let the faculty show the students what they were reading or should be reading, and then provide some degree of transparency for a wall that, if we had built it solid, would actually simply turn this into a fairly unpleasant hallway. This is a house in Pennsylvania, and with this particular house, our major problem is that we had to submit a front elevation to the local covenant or the local organization that was going to approve your project. And you didn't have to submit plans. You didn't have to. The only thing being reviewed was the front elevation. So this was our front elevation, and we figured that this would not get any resistance. And indeed it didn't. It's really quite logical. It's the front of the house. But given the fact that the site actually extends out quite a bit quite a bit away from the front entry, and also the views are off, not actually towards the street, but actually out this way. As you move around the building, it inverts from that kind of pitched roof into a butterfly roof, expanding out into the landscape, moving from, in a sense, a kind of closed pitched roof environment where the retaining walls are pulled up against the building, to a more open glass pavilion where the retaining walls start to peel back and even into the landscape itself. Ordos. You may or may not have, at this point, I think most people have probably heard about this project. We got asked amongst some colleagues in the room to be one of 100 architects from around the world to each build a 10,000 square foot villa in China, in Inner Mongolia, in Ordos. And so this is the anticipated development. And this is the kind of incredibly egalitarian master plan. Some might say ruthless, others say it provides great equality and a kind of common ground on which to judge the differences between the different projects. Here's the footprint. Everyone was given the same footprint to work with. And this is our site down here. We drew numbers out of a kind of a lottery, and somehow we got into a kind of New York ghetto down here. The interesting thing about this is that we started to realize that the project had almost respond more to the idiosyncrasies of the project, the kind of how do I put this? Not the act of designing a house in isolation, but actually act of designing a building relative to this peculiar arrangement. I should show you that this is the site. It's essentially a kind of an ultimate fantasy where there's very little there in terms of infrastructure and roads. There's the anticipation of these 100 villas and the kind of development that works in conjunction with it. And here's what happens when you distribute 100 international architects. They're all wearing black. And that's my brother, and the photographs kind of speak for themselves. There's no question there's a surreal moment to this. This is our site, number 93. That's Mark Cermacchi, taking a lay of the land. I mean, there's nothing we could do that would ever exceed the kind of wonder of these photographs. I mean, this is really the highlight of the project for me. Okay, so we still respond to this kind of great possibility of doing a very large house, actually much larger than we've ever designed before. And when we started to realize there were actually three constraints that we're going to have to contend with by visiting the site. One is that there are two building types that stood out for us. One is a building that attempted to actually exceed or at least push the limits of the local construction industry. A much more ambitious building, but it actually suffered as a result. It didn't seem as though the kind of construction industry had the capacity to, in this local area, to deal with some of the issues, the complex and forms. You end up have moments where that's one of the strangest hand railings I've seen. But we realized that since we actually were not going to be in charge of the CDs, we were not going to be in charge of the construction documents, so we had to actually accept a certain amount of, we had to release a certain amount of control, and therefore we couldn't push the expectations of the construction. In part, and here's another detail of that particular building. On the other hand, the other type of construction we started to see, a more traditional load-bearing stone work, was actually quite beautiful. This Ai Weiwei's work with fake design, and there's some really gorgeous qualities of the material. Again, fairly straightforward construction, but had really interesting qualities. So we realized that had to be a direction we'd go in. The kind of use of single materials, not in complex geometries, but in terms of fairly rectilinear, and making explicit as possible the role of those materials. The other aspect was that this thing was a kind of media circus, and that at some level your project had to actually be identified in as quick a way as possible. The diagram had to be seductive and carry the heart of the project. This thing was an architectural petting zoo. I mean, it's just which is both fantastic. I mean, it's really unprecedented, and but it meant that what you're not doing a house on a landscape. You're doing a house within a context of a petting zoo. And so, how do you find a way that you actually produce interiors relative to this issue? So what we started to think about is can we work with, in a sense, a kind of way of imagining that the building is really split between public and private. The public is actually space exfoliates or moves out into the site and captures the site as interiorized spaces. So migrating the surfaces of those walls out to pick up the courtyard so that one could actually produce some sense of closure, intimacy within the context of this environment. And then to play up a way, or play with a way that each one of these walls would actually be treated with a single surface. They'd all be load-bearing walls. And then those load-bearing walls would work their way up through sections. So from the courtyard to the dining area to the wood of the pool, core 10 ceiling, each of these enclosures, the exfoliating lower level, would essentially work its way up through sections. So here you see a moment where the tile actually works its way up and becomes the bathroom wall, and then even onto the rooftop. The difference between these two, kind of the split personalities of the building, is played out within or registered really by an 18-inch clear story gap, where in effect the kind of more heavy volume appears to float on top of the courtyard. Really looking at ways that we could get the public and private to have an interesting exchange in section, but still maintain that kind of diagrammatic clarity in elevation. Another view of the brick on top of the cast-in-place concrete. And here, the interiors, I think, are inherently going to be seem empty. We don't know who the client is. It's 10,000 square feet for ostensibly a family that's only supposed to have one child. So it's a little bit tricky to imagine how it's going to be inhabited. But I think Ordos itself is a fantastic experiment, and I'm thrilled to have been part of this process. So, but the interiors were tricky, and we struggled with these. And I can't say I'm actually I have problems with them. Let's just put it that way. So. Okay, art house. Oh yeah, sure. But it's holding the light. So yeah, sure. Or maybe I could just stand still like that. So. All right. Art house at the Jones Center. This project just broke ground 2 weeks ago, I'm very pleased to say, and should be completed in 2010. If you know Austin, it's dead center. This is the capital of Texas. This is Congress Avenue, and this is 7th. And it's right in the heart of the city. So it's a fantastic location. And the building itself was originally a 1920s theater, and then it was converted into a 1950s department store. And the department store, I think, closed about 15 years ago, and about 10 years ago, the lower level only was converted into a contemporary art center. And we were asked to come in and imagine how to, in a sense, turn it into a building that looked more like a contemporary art center, and also make the second floor and the roof available for more programs. So our thought really was to take advantage of what really was this kind of great Russian doll quality to the building, in that there was a concrete deck on top of steel column, second floor that was put in for the department store that was nested inside of the concrete column steel truss of the theater. So you have this kind of accumulation of different histories. And we felt that the approach was to not try to whitewash and get rid of this history, but actually to build upon it, kind of to see all of our operations in this it's a budget of less than $200 a square foot, and to try to do everything by taking advantage of what's there, tactically enhancing it, adding to it in discrete ways, but ultimately transforming the whole building through this accumulation. One of the major features was to try to figure out how we could actually deal with the fact that most of the walls are fairly blank, which makes sense because theaters, department stores, and to a certain degree, contemporary art centers don't really need windows. But our sense was, could we find a way that we could still perforate the elevation without introducing a punched window? In a sense, could we invent a kind of new aperture? We worked with 4-inch wide by 16-inch high glass blocks that originally were dispersed as a kind of even grid across this skin. But then these started to be aggregated where you needed light, for example, where the studios are, where the offices are, and moved away where you don't need light. So in a sense, you'd get an elevation that would appear random, but the randomness actually belies a kind of X-ray, if you will, of the program that exists inside. More importantly, on the inside, you start to get this kind of great accumulation of these different layers. So you can see the balcony of the theater, which was severed off when they put in the second floor of the department store, and we're simply going to leave this all here, but add in a kind of new layer of these glass blocks onto the surface. And at night, the glass blocks are all lit by computer-controlled LEDs, so they can be animated relative to anyone's particular desire. The 1950s awnings we left, but we kind of put it on steroids. So in a sense, it now becomes the kind of entry sign. One actually walks into the building through a kind of sculptural extension of the awning. And then the awning is also brought down and forms a kind of division between the sidewalk and the galleries beyond. Looking at ways that we can introduce kind of some local continuity and moments of humor, we like the fact that the stair would be simultaneously quite heavy, but then also be suspended. So you'd move from a moment of kind of climbing on top of these concrete or precast concrete planks, and then kind of stepping onto this drop-down wood stair that really is an extension actually all the way up to the wood deck above, seen better in the cross-section here. And this forms this fairly interesting kind of volume that encourages people to move from the lower level up to the main second floor gallery beyond. The second floor gallery we tried to treat as open as possible. There's going to be one 80-foot long wall that slides on top of the existing, or slides on the existing trusses. And interestingly enough, these trusses were actually too weak, and we had to, even on their own right, they were too weak, so we had to add more steel to them. That steel is actually the track that now holds this moving wall. Part of the argument here is that often galleries build walls, tear them down, build walls, tear them down. So we wanted to find a way that you could have one wall that you could position in different locations that would have to be reacted to, but would hopefully reduce the kind of waste of construction, and if not needed, could simply be pushed out of the way, covering over the features of the existing building that I showed in the previous image. And finally, the roof is planned to be simultaneously a kind of screening room, earned income location. Some of the Board of Trustees want to make sure we get this thing completed so that they can host birthday parties. It should actually prove to be quite a social center within the heart of Austin, Texas. The project has been going on for about 4.5 years, in part because there are a year and a half of fundraising. So we also got involved in architectural representations that became like fuller brush kits. So here's a fundraising technique where you can have your model with the drawings and be able to ship it around. And these have actually proved quite effective in that the fundraising's almost all in place. And as I mentioned, the project should open in about 8 months. And finally, let me move to probably one of the smaller projects we've done. And here we're asked almost to come in as artists. It's an interesting shift for us. And it's a building, we are asked to come in as artists to work in the context of a lobby in an SOM building in the Upper East Side of Manhattan. The building, unfortunately, the construction is a little bit slowed, but we've completed the art piece. So it's an interesting question. How do you do art within the context of someone else's lobby? I'm not a big fan of what I call kind of plop art that kind of sits there, doesn't seem to have a kind of an engagement with its environment. But on the other hand, we didn't want to kind of add something that wasn't kind of logical relative to the lobby itself. So our thought was, all right, what happens if we actually take the act of looking at our site here and use that to actually generate the very form that they would be looking at. So essentially, almost like kind of a piece that speaks only of the very act of what it's supposed to be doing. So we took a kind of standard locations of people within this lobby, mapped them against the kind of bell curve of human heights, projected those positions against the wall so that we'd basically have about, I think, about 200 positions within the lobby. We had 200 slots within the grid of our site. And in a sense, by having these cones of projection hit the wall with the assumption of about a 6-inch diameter, you'd get slight differences on the front relative to the anamorphic projection of these points of view, but the backside would actually start to really open up like Swiss cheese. So in a sense, one would get about 420 stainless steel boxes that you see here, and the corners of the boxes would then all register this grid on the front, whereas then the back would, as I mentioned, be much more opened up. Each of these boxes, here's a view of the kind of initial study, and we like the fact that there'd always be one moment as you walk through here where one of these would line up, but you'd never get the ability to look through it more than one time. There'd be hints of almost kind of lining up, but not quite. The piece was made by digitally cutting all of the boxes, all of the sides of the stainless steel. It involved this elaborate rig because as you weld these sides together, there'd be expansion and compression. So it had a pneumatic jig that would eject the device after it was welded before it had cooled. Each of these boxes was then hand ground. The inside was powder coated. There's an incredible amount of labor that went into each of these. And we got the opportunity to install it in a temporary space in Philadelphia because the building itself is behind schedule. But we wanted to kind of see what this actually looked like. The metal fabricator worked on this continuously for a year. And the effect is really quite interesting. You get here's the front side, as I mentioned, and then the back side. Ironically, the cost for this project exceeded the cost of all the restaurants that I showed at the beginning of the talk. So we got this project by essentially being an artist. So yeah, it makes you wonder about the role of architecture sometimes. But anyway, so you get the difference between the front and the back of the piece. And some details, the kind of close-up look. And for me, one of the nice aspects of this project is it took a very simple issue, the act of looking, which is what we were trying to engage anyways, and used it to generate this really complex geometry that then had to be played out through a fairly complicated and time-consuming act of fabrication and construction. So. It was a moment where we were able to kind of look at those opportunistic exchanges between the issues that came to play at the beginning of a project, and then realize it through fairly extensive research and through the kind of need to externalize and bring the project to fruition. So thank you very much. Sure. I'm happy to take questions. The first I didn't quite hear the second question. The first question was with all the variables that we introduced into the project, how do we control the budget? And the second was, how do we control the budget when and the craftsmanship and a complicated project? I think I don't necessarily see lots of variables being an anathema to budget, which is to say, the fact that you're trying to intertwine a series of different issues doesn't necessarily make something more expensive. I think for us, one of the real issues is the second half of that question, which is what we try to do as much as possible is test things out. So, and let me try to make a particular example in that the Fluff Bakery. the felt wall, which introduces lots of variables from your standpoint, a mixture of materials that's unprecedented, hadn't been done, contractor didn't know what the hell they were dealing with. The way we were able to get around that is actually by doing lots of mock-ups, proving that it could be done, getting the fire rating of it, essentially shifting the role of the architect and not simply kind of producing drawings and expecting the contractor to figure it out, but actually shifting the agency of the architect or beyond that threshold and moving into construction ourselves. So we still maintain a very large wood shop or relatively large wood shop and metal shops precisely to not let the architect's role be that of simply kind of design and drawing and someone else has to realize it. So my answer to that question would be that what you have to do as an architect is take on more responsibility, take on and see design invention in a much greater arena, so you don't limit yourself to simply drawings and conventions of construction, but get actively involved in the various variables, as you put it, and in the complexity of the construction. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a really good question, which is, do our drawings, are they simply representational tools, or do they actually test things? And then, is the project itself based on the logic of perspective? And I'd say the answer is very much the case that the technique of doing the cross-sectional perspectives allows us to continue the design process. And quite literally, we'll be working in the office with a team of people, and the Rhino models used to mass out positions, program, organization, and so forth. But then when the drawings are done over top of the Rhino model, that's when we, and it's usually the three partners, actually come in and add all the details, the handrails, organization, sorry, not organization, configurations, fenestration, et cetera, all the things that would take forever to render, if you will, we're able to do through hand. And then there's a kind of a process that goes back and forth. So in a sense, we're able to benefit in those drawings from the kind of painterly qualities that come out of renderings, namely shadow, color, tone, et cetera, but combine them with the kind of line-based issues of threshold, detail, edge, and so forth. The cross-sectional nature, for me, is absolutely important in that we want to simultaneously, as I mentioned in one of the projects, be able to show a kind of cut that's measurable and seems to be kind of an abstract cut, which is the section, and to play that against the optical experience of being in that space. So, quite literally, that project that I showed, the Park Tower project, we only designed half the building. I don't know what's in the other half, because we cut a section and designed, I mean, we know it works and there are ramps that go up, but I don't really know what's in the other half. So yeah, it only exists as a cross-section, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's certainly, sorry, I have to repeat the question. Actually, that's hard. I just forgot the details of the way you phrased it, which is better that I can paraphrase it. So anyway, I mean, it's not, my response to the question would be, it's not simply the role of hand drawing versus the digital. It's a larger question of making sure that you're not simply beholden to the agency of a program or beholden to something that's been scripted for you. And that comes down to whether it's at the level of drawings where we like to get the oscillation between techniques, that it's the combination that we can really choreograph and control and use to means and techniques and ends that are not simply kind of built into a logic that's being given to us. But that desire to kind of hybridize and to kind of work between systems also plays out on the way in which we approach the buildings or the architecture, or the way in which they're done. that goes back to that issue of how do you shift the agency of the architect, so you're not fitting into conventional organizations and logics, but you're saying, well, all right, what's the most fruitful way for us to explore this project is often not to kind of accept that kind of those givens. So, but yeah, there are other more pragmatic answers to that question, which is when we're working in an office, we have to allow for multiple people to be involved in a project. So, but we also don't want to lose some engagement with that project ourselves. So, digital models are fantastic because lots of people can work on them. The hand allows us to more efficiently advance the design and to make sure that that's being brought in. But it also connects to that issue of the oscillation between kind of the different techniques I was mentioning before. So, I don't bemoan. It's like, I think it has as much to do with the fact that we were educated at a moment where computers were coming into school, but a lot of our work is done by hand. I still like I don't fetishize the fact that it's done by hand, but it as a technique is faster in some cases than other ones. But I don't see, I would say it's unfortunate that it's lost, but I also think that it's painful to teach. So I'm not sure I for years taught people how to hand draw perspectives. I'm not sure I ever want to do it again. So, but I do think understanding, vanishing point, station point, picture plane, understanding how the logic of these things are generated. So when you're in Rhino and you're trying to figure out how to do a dimetric versus trimetric, which it doesn't do very well, versus a 1-point or 2-point perspective, you understand how it's configuring these things. It's an issue of knowledge and control, and I think hand construction actually gave you a greater understanding of the kind of different options. But it's different. I don't lament it from a kind of Luddite standpoint. Yeah. So, yeah. Yeah. Right. The question was who's essentially funding these projects, whether there's the speculative projects. I would say some of the projects are unfunded. They're simply, we were given an opportunity in a context of an exhibition, a gallery. I will say that we, as a corollary to that, we haven't done very many competitions, in part because the United States kind of format for competitions are very frustrating. Most competitions aren't built, even though they're intended to be built. They'll often use the ideas to maybe fundraise, and so we've been frustrated by the fact that you spend more time fighting the competition brief than you do developing your own project. So working with the ability to externalize the work in the context of an exhibition, we like doing self-generated projects that have the ability to be shown. But by being self-generated, we can kind of define the terms, the research that would go into it, and not feel as though we're simply kind of having to pigeonhole that into a competition brief. That said, the two visioning projects were essentially funded by their local neighborhood business improvement district. The latter one was funded by the Downtown Alliance, and the first one was funded by kind of an ad hoc organization around Hudson Square, real estate owners who were worried that the city was going to put a garbage dump, and they needed to find a way to image their neighborhood in a way to fight back against this impending worry. What's that? I think it's still in process. It's interesting. It did get a lot of press, so in a sense, it changed the image of the neighborhood. I mean, and it's a branding, exercise, and at least for the moment, it forestalled. But I'm not. I have to admit, I haven't been following the nuances of it to answer that fully. That's a good question. I mean, what's the difference in amount of research in the green sponge versus the drive-up skyscraper? The green sponge, to be honest, was a much quicker project because of it was one piece of a larger study about the sustainable possibilities for a neighborhood. And as I mentioned, a lot of the sustainable issues don't play out in visual means. It was actually a kind of much larger narrative. So the sponge itself was a pretty quick one-off kind of idea, whereas the drive-up skyscraper was much more complicated, in which we wanted to work out all of the numbers, parking, had to figure out the kind of the floor-to-floor spatial kind of positioning of the ramps, make sure that the interiors of those things could be terraced so that your program wasn't always on a slope. That was a much more complicated project. But also the venues were different. Park Tower was set up for Venice Biennale. The Green Sponge was much shorter. It had a much kind of shorter lifespan and was, as I mentioned, a smaller. What's that? Actually, we could. Can I steal that idea from you? So, yeah, last question. No, none whatsoever. We were thrilled to get the commission. No, and I don't mean that glibly. In the sense that I find a lot of the distinctions between I'm an artist, I'm an architect, kind of not that interesting, and it seems to be a kind of territorial marking that's about kind of preserving that territory rather than the interesting overlaps. And frankly, it was for us a great opportunity, and we had no problem shifting into the role. We actually never even we never once hesitated to wonder whether it was something we should or shouldn't do. So for us, one of the intriguing things about that is we were asked to do it because of the restaurants, which were someone had seen us present the restaurants, was very interested in the way in which they transformed the nature of those interiors, and out of that wanted us to pursue that project. So again, I think that the divisions between artist, architect, landscape architect, et cetera, are more artificial and less useful than they might be claimed to be by their separate professional organizations. So, all right, thank you. So.